Helena Blackwood sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Morrison & Associates, her hands trembling slightly as she signed the final document. At 63 years old, she had just made the biggest purchase of her life, and the most romantic gesture she could imagine.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Whitmore Industries, her husband Richard's company, the place where he had worked for 32 years, climbing from junior accountant to chief financial officer. "Congratulations, Mrs. Blackwood," the attorney said, sliding the paperwork into a leather portfolio. "You are now the sole owner of Whitmore Industries, $473 million, and it's all yours." Helena smiled, her silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. She had spent 18 months orchestrating this acquisition in absolute secrecy, using her inheritance from her late father's pharmaceutical empire, money Richard never knew existed because she had kept it in a trust he couldn't access. Her father had been a cautious man. Before he died, he had made her promise to keep this money separate, to never tell Richard about it. At the time, Helena had thought it was just her father's lingering disapproval of her husband. Now, signing these papers, she was glad she had kept that promise, if only because it allowed her to create this incredible surprise. "My husband has given this company his entire career," Helena said softly. "He's sacrificed so much. Missed birthdays, anniversaries, our daughter's graduation, all for Whitmore Industries. I wanted to give him something that would show him how much I appreciate everything he's done." The attorney nodded, though Helena caught something in his expression. A flicker of something that looked almost like pity. She dismissed it. Lawyers were always so pessimistic, always seeing problems where there were none. "The annual company celebration is in 3 weeks," Helena continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "That's when I'll announce it. I'll call him up to the stage in front of all his colleagues, all those people who have watched him work so hard, and I'll tell everyone that their beloved CFO is now married to the owner, that we're partners in every sense of the word." She had rehearsed the speech 100 times in her mind. She would talk about their 40 years of marriage, about how Richard had supported her through her father's illness, about the sacrifices they had both made. She would tell everyone that this company, his company, was now their legacy to build together. "Mrs. Blackwood," the attorney said carefully, "as the new owner, you'll have full access to all company records, financial statements, personnel files, everything. I should mention that the previous owners requested a comprehensive audit be completed before the final transfer. The results will be available to you by end of week." Helena waved her hand dismissively. "I'm sure everything is in order. Richard has been managing the finances for over 2 decades. He's meticulous about these things." The attorney's expression flickered again, but he said nothing more. Helena drove home that afternoon with tears in her eyes. Happy tears, she told herself. She pictured Richard's face when he learned the truth. He would be shocked, certainly, maybe even overwhelmed. But then he would understand the depth of her love, the magnitude of her gesture. Their sprawling estate in Greenwich looked particularly beautiful in the autumn light. Helena had chosen this house 30 years ago, when Richard's career was just taking off. She had decorated every room herself, raised their daughter Emma within these walls, hosted countless dinner parties for Richard's colleagues and clients. She had been a perfect corporate wife, always smiling at functions, always remembering names and birthdays, always making sure Richard looked successful and happy, and she had done it gladly, because she loved him with every fiber of her being. Richard wasn't home yet. He rarely was before 8 o'clock these days. Helena poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the sunroom, watching the leaves fall from the oak trees that lined their property. The silence of the house wrapped around her like a familiar blanket, comforting and suffocating all at once. She thought about their life together. They had met at a charity gala when Helena was 23 and Richard was 25. He had been handsome and ambitious, with eyes that seemed to see right through her. She had fallen hard and fast, defying her father's wishes to marry a man with no family money and uncertain prospects. "He'll never amount to anything," her father had warned. "You're throwing away your future for a pretty face. Men like that, they see your name, they see your inheritance, and they calculate." But Helena had proven him wrong, or so she believed. Richard had amounted to something. He had built a career, provided a comfortable life, given her a daughter she adored. Yes, he worked too much. Yes, he had grown distant over the years. But what marriage didn't have its challenges after 4 decades? Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Richard. "Working late. Don't wait up." Helena smiled sadly. This was their routine now. She couldn't remember the last time they had eaten dinner together, the last time he had looked at her the way he used to, the last time he had touched her with anything resembling passion or even affection. But that would change. Once she revealed her surprise, everything would change. She was certain of it. She began planning the details of her announcement. She would need a new dress, something elegant but not ostentatious. She would hire the best caterers, the finest musicians. The ballroom at the Whitmore Industries headquarters would be transformed into a celebration of their love, their partnership, their future together. Helena walked through the empty rooms of her mansion, running her fingers along furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She had everything money could buy, except the one thing she wanted most: her husband's attention, his presence, his love. When had things changed? She tried to pinpoint the moment, but it had been so gradual. The late nights had started years ago. The business trips that stretched from days to weeks. The way Richard would look at his phone during dinner, always distracted, always somewhere else. She had made excuses for him. The company was demanding. The economy was uncertain. He was providing for their family. She had told herself these lies so many times that she had started to believe them. Their daughter Emma lived in California now, with her own family, her own life. She called once a week, always asking the same question: "Is Dad there?" And Helena always gave the same answer: "He's working late, sweetheart. You know how he is." Helena fell asleep on the sunroom couch that night, dreaming of the moment when Richard would finally see how much she had done for him, how much she had always done. In her dreams, he swept her into his arms and told her he loved her, that he had always loved her, that he was sorry for all the missed dinners and forgotten anniversaries. In her dreams, he was still the man she had married, the man who had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, who had promised to cherish her forever, who had made her believe in happily ever after. She had no idea that in exactly 3 weeks, her entire world would shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. She had no idea that the company she had just bought would reveal secrets that had been hidden for years. She had no idea that her romantic gesture would become the instrument of her husband's destruction and her own liberation. For now, Helena Blackwood slept peacefully, believing in love, believing in her marriage, believing in the man who had shared her bed for 40 years. Some illusions take decades to build. They can crumble in a single night, and sometimes the crumbling is the kindest thing that can happen. The audit report arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope marked "Confidential for owner's eyes only." Helena had been reviewing fabric swatches for the party decorations when the doorbell rang. She signed for the package absently, her mind still on whether the ivory tablecloths would complement the gold centerpieces she had ordered. She almost set the envelope aside unopened. Almost. But something made her pause. The attorney's expression from the closing, perhaps, or the weight of the package in her hands. She carried it to Richard's home office, a room she rarely entered because he kept it locked when he was away. Now, as the owner of Whitmore Industries, she had keys to everything. The first page of the audit was dry financial data, balance sheets, quarterly reports, profit margins. Helena's eyes glazed over the numbers. This wasn't her world. This was Richard's domain, and she had always trusted him to handle it. Then she reached page 47. Irregularities in accounts payable, the section header read. Discrepancies totaling approximately $12.4 million over a 7-year period. Funds diverted to shell companies with no apparent business purpose. Authorized solely by Chief Financial Officer Richard Blackwood. Helena read the paragraph 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding something. Richard was meticulous. Richard was honest. Richard would never... She kept reading. The shell companies had names that meant nothing. Sunset Holdings, Azure Ventures, Coastal Properties, LLC. But the audit had traced the money. followed it through a labyrinth of offshore accounts and wire transfers, and discovered where it ultimately landed: a penthouse apartment in Manhattan, a villa in the Cayman Islands, a jewelry account at Cartier with purchases totaling over $800,000, none of which Helena had ever seen. Her hands began to shake. There had to be an explanation. Richard would explain everything. There was some business reason, some investment strategy she didn't understand. She turned to the appendix and found the photographs. They had been taken by the previous owner's private investigator, hired when the financial discrepancies first appeared. The images were clinical, documentary, time-stamped and dated like evidence in a court case. Richard at a restaurant with a woman half his age. Richard holding hands with the same woman on a beach. Richard and the woman entering the Manhattan penthouse together, his arm around her waist, his face wearing an expression Helena hadn't seen in 20 years. He was smiling, genuinely smiling, the way he used to smile at her. The woman was beautiful. Dark hair, perfect figure, clothes that probably cost thousands of dollars. Clothes that Helena's husband had apparently purchased with money he had stolen from his own company. Helena felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart. That would come later. This was something more fundamental, like the foundation of a house shifting after decades of hidden water damage. She forced herself to keep reading. The appendix included transcripts of emails recovered from Richard's work computer. The IT department had flagged them during a routine security review, but had been ordered to delete them by Richard himself. The previous owners had retrieved them from backup servers. "Can't wait to see you tonight, baby. The old dinosaur thinks I'm at a conference in Chicago. LOL. Did you see her at the Christmas party? She's gotten so fat and pathetic. I don't know how I stand coming home to that every night. Just a few more years and I'll have enough to leave. We'll go somewhere she'll never find us. You, me, and all the money I've been putting away. She actually thinks I love her. Can you believe it? After all these years, she still looks at me with those puppy dog eyes. It's disgusting, but useful. She never questions where I am or what I'm doing." Helena read those words, fat and pathetic, old dinosaur, disgusting, and felt something shift inside her. The crack in her chest began to spread, but it wasn't filling with grief. It was filling with ice. She thought of all the business trips, all the late nights at the office. She thought of the way Richard had stopped touching her years ago, how he flinched when she tried to hold his hand, how he always found excuses to sleep in the guest room. She had blamed herself. She had gone on diets, bought expensive lingerie, tried to be more interesting, more attractive, more worthy of his attention. She had spent years believing she was the problem, that if she could just be better, thinner, younger, more interesting, Richard would love her again. And all that time he had been laughing at her, calling her names to his mistress, counting down the days until he could abandon her with nothing. Helena closed the audit report and sat in silence for a long moment. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity. She thought about the past 7 years, the period covered by the fraud. 7 years of birthday dinners eaten alone. 7 years of falling asleep waiting for a husband who was in someone else's bed. 7 years of wondering what she had done wrong to make him so distant. Nothing. She had done nothing wrong. He was the monster. He had always been the monster. Her father's words echoed in her memory. Men like that, they see your name, they see your inheritance, and they calculate. She had spent 40 years proving her father wrong, and it turned out he had been right all along. Helena picked up her phone and called the attorney. "Morrison," she said, her voice perfectly steady, "I need you to do something for me. I want the full audit expanded. I want to know every dollar my husband has stolen, every account he's hidden, every lie he's told, and I want it all documented and ready to present in 3 weeks. Mrs. Blackwood, I also need you to engage a forensic accountant, the best one you can find. Money is no object, and I'll need a criminal attorney on retainer, someone who specializes in financial crimes and embezzlement, someone who has put men like my husband in prison." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "May I ask what you're planning?" Helena looked at the photograph still clutched in her trembling hand. Richard smiling at another woman, wearing happiness like a mask he had never shown his wife. "The annual company celebration is in 3 weeks," she said. "I was planning to give my husband a surprise. I've decided the surprise will simply be different than I originally intended. Mrs. Blackwood, if I may offer some advice." "You may not," Helena said calmly. "I've spent 40 years taking advice from people who told me to be patient, to be understanding, to stand by my husband. I'm done taking advice. Now I'm giving orders. Have everything ready by the celebration date. No excuses." She hung up the phone and sat alone in the office that smelled like Richard's cologne, surrounded by the evidence of 40 years of lies. The romantic gesture had died. In its place, something else was being born. Something cold and calculated. Something that had been dormant inside Helena for 63 years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She had been raised to be a lady, polite, gracious, forgiving. Her mother had taught her that a woman's power lay in gentleness, in patience, in quiet endurance. Her mother had been wrong. Helena Blackwood had spent 4 decades being the perfect wife, patient, understanding, forgiving. She had swallowed her loneliness, rationalized her husband's coldness, blamed herself for his distance. She was done forgiving. She was done understanding. She was done being the fool who loved a man who had never loved her back. The surprise party would go on exactly as planned. The decorations would be beautiful. The food would be exquisite. The music would be perfect. And in front of 500 guests, Richard's colleagues, his subordinates, the business contacts he had spent 30 years cultivating, Helena would show them exactly who their beloved CFO really was. Not a loyal employee, not a devoted husband. A thief and a liar who had stolen millions while his wife waited at home, wondering what she had done wrong. Helena smiled for the first time since opening the envelope. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had finally stopped waiting. The ballroom of Whitmore Industries headquarters had been transformed into a palace of light and elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across the marble floors. Tables draped in ivory silk held arrangements of white roses and gold-leafed branches. A 20-piece orchestra played softly in the corner. Helena stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. She wore a gown of deep burgundy silk that she had chosen specifically for this night. The color of wine, the color of blood, the color of power. Around her neck hung her mother's pearls, the ones she had worn on her wedding day 40 years ago. Tonight, they felt less like a symbol of marriage and more like armor. "Mrs. Blackwood, you look stunning," said Marcus Chen, the head of marketing. "Richard is a lucky man." Helena smiled graciously, the expression so practiced it required no effort. "Thank you, Marcus. Please, enjoy the champagne." She had perfected this role over 40 years, the supportive wife, the gracious hostess, the woman behind the successful man. Tonight would be her final performance. More guests arrived in a steady stream: executives, board members, major shareholders, important clients. Helena greeted each one with the same warm smile, the same gentle handshake, the same practiced pleasantries she had delivered at 100 such events. None of them suspected anything. To them, she was still just Richard's wife, a decorative accessory, a woman whose only role was to make her husband look good. They would learn differently before the night was over. Richard arrived late, as always. He swept into the ballroom with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with the ease of a born politician. He barely glanced at Helena. "You look nice," he said dismissively, already scanning the room for more important people to impress. "Try not to embarrass me tonight. These are important clients." Helena felt the familiar sting of his words, but tonight it was distant, muffled by the cold certainty of what was to come. "Of course, Richard. I know my place." He walked away without another word, gravitating toward a cluster of executives near the bar. Helena watched him laugh at someone's joke, clap another man on the shoulder, perform the role of the charming CFO with practiced ease. She wondered if anyone in that room knew the truth about him. Probably not. Richard had spent decades constructing his facade, and he was very, very good at it. But facades, like all things built on lies, eventually crumbled. The evening progressed exactly as Richard expected. Cocktails and conversation. Dinner service. 5 courses of exquisitely prepared food that Helena had chosen, and Richard hadn't bothered to taste before approving. Speeches from the board of directors praising the company's success and its bright future. Helena sat through it all with perfect composure, playing the role of devoted wife while her husband ignored her completely. She watched him charm the investors, flatter the executives, work the room with the skill of a con artist, which she now knew was exactly what he was. Then came the moment Richard had been told was his tribute, a recognition of his 32 years of dedicated service. "And now," the board chairman announced, "I'd like to invite our CFO's lovely wife, Helena Blackwood, to the stage. She has a very special surprise for her husband tonight." Applause rippled through the ballroom. Richard beamed, straightening his tie, already composing his expression of humble gratitude. He loved these moments. The adoration, the recognition, the validation of his carefully constructed image. Helena walked to the podium with measured steps, her heart steady, her hands calm. She looked out at the sea of faces, 500 people who had gathered to celebrate a company built on her husband's crimes. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice clear and strong. "My husband Richard has given 32 years to Whitmore Industries. 32 years of dedication, sacrifice, and hard work, and I've watched every moment of it." Richard nodded along, his smile wide and self-satisfied. "What many of you don't know," Helena continued, "is that I recently acquired this company. Whitmore Industries now belongs entirely to me." A murmur of surprise swept through the crowd. Richard's smile flickered, confused, but not yet alarmed. He assumed this was part of the surprise, a gift. Something that would make him look even more successful. "I bought this company because I wanted to give my husband a gift, a tribute to his career, a symbol of my appreciation for everything he has done." Helena paused, letting the silence stretch. "But then I received the audit report." Richard's smile vanished. The report that documented $12.4 million in embezzled funds, $12.4 million stolen from this company over 7 years, funneled through shell corporations and hidden in offshore accounts. The murmur became a roar. People turned to look at Richard, who had gone pale beneath the chandeliers. His carefully constructed composure was cracking, showing the terrified man beneath. The report that included photographs of my husband with his mistress, a woman he has been seeing for 7 years while I waited at home like a fool, wondering why he never came back for dinner. Helena's voice remained steady, but there was steel in it now. The steel of a woman who had been forged by decades of neglect and humiliation. The report that included emails where my husband called me fat and pathetic, where he described me as disgusting, where he counted down the days until he could abandon me and disappear with the money he stole. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Helena, stop this. You're making a scene. Sit down, Richard." The words cut through the ballroom like a blade. Richard froze, stunned by a tone he had never heard from his wife in 40 years of marriage. "I'm not finished," Helena said calmly. "You've had 32 years to speak. Tonight, you're going to listen." She turned back to the crowd, many of whom sat frozen in shock. Some had their phones out, recording. "Good. Let them record. Let the whole world see what kind of man Richard Blackwood really was. What my husband didn't know, what he never bothered to find out, is that I am not the foolish, pathetic woman he believed me to be. My father left me a substantial inheritance, which I kept separate from our marriage specifically because he warned me about men like Richard." A bitter smile crossed Helena's face. "I should have listened to him sooner." She lifted a glass of champagne from the podium. She had placed it there herself, hours earlier. "I would like to propose a toast," Helena said, "to my husband Richard Blackwood. Thief, liar, adulterer." At that moment, Richard lunged forward, his face twisted with rage, the mask finally, completely gone. He grabbed a glass of murky water from a nearby service station, water that had been used to rinse dirty dishes. "You want to humiliate me?" he snarled, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "You stupid old cow. You've been dead weight around my neck for 40 years. A pathetic, useless burden I had to drag through every event, every dinner, Every moment of my life. He threw the dirty water directly at Helena's face. The liquid hit her burgundy gown, splashing across her chest and dripping down the expensive silk. Her mother's pearls glistened with grime. The ballroom gasped in collective horror. Helena stood perfectly still as the water dripped from her chin. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply looked at her husband with an expression of absolute, terrifying calm. "Thank you, Richard," she said quietly, her voice carrying through the silent room. "Thank you for showing everyone exactly who you are." She turned to the two men in dark suits who had been standing near the exit all evening. Men Richard had assumed were additional security. "Officers," Helena said, "I believe you have everything you need." The men stepped forward, and only then did Richard notice the badges on their belts. Only then did the color drain completely from his face. "Richard Blackwood," one of them said, "you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." Richard's face contorted with rage as they handcuffed him. "You can't do this. I'll destroy you, Helena. I'll take everything. You'll be sorry you ever crossed me." Helena watched them lead her husband away, dirty water still dripping from her ruined dress. The ballroom remained silent. 500 witnesses to the fall of a man who had believed himself untouchable. She had given him 40 years of her life. He had given her nothing but lies. Now, at 63 years old, Helena Blackwood was finally free. The aftermath of the ballroom scene played out in ways Helena could never have predicted. The video went viral within hours. Someone at the party, several someones actually, had been recording when Richard threw the dirty water at his wife. Within a day, it had been viewed over 10 million times. By the end of the week, it had become a cultural phenomenon. Headlines blazed across every news outlet. "CFO throws dirty water on wife after she reveals his embezzlement." "Woman buys company to expose cheating husband." "The most savage divorce in corporate history." Helena sat in her study, watching the coverage with a strange sense of detachment. She hadn't planned for any of this. She had simply wanted to expose Richard, to stop him from hurting her anymore, to take control of her own life for the first time in 40 years. She hadn't expected to become a symbol. The support poured in from everywhere. Thousands of messages from women who had lived through similar experiences. The neglect, the gaslighting, the years of being told they weren't enough. They called her brave. They called her an inspiration. They called her a hero. Helena didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who had finally stopped pretending. One letter in particular stayed with her. It came from a woman named Margaret in Ohio, who wrote about her own 30-year marriage to a man who had controlled every aspect of her life. "I watched you stand there with that water dripping down your face," Margaret wrote, "and you didn't cry. You didn't break. You just looked at him like he was nothing. I want to be that strong someday." Helena read that letter 3 times and cried. Not from sadness, but from a connection she had never expected to feel with strangers across the country. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. The evidence against Richard was overwhelming. The audit trail, the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the photographs, the emails. His lawyers tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was determined to make an example of him. Richard's mistress disappeared within days of the arrest, presumably to one of the foreign countries where she could avoid being subpoenaed. She took the jewelry and the villa in the Caymans, leaving Richard with nothing but his legal bills and his shattered reputation. Helena received divorce papers the morning after Richard's bail hearing. He was demanding half of everything: the house, the investments, even Whitmore Industries itself. His lawyers argued that as her husband of 40 years, he was entitled to marital assets regardless of his criminal behavior. Helena's attorney had laughed when she showed him the filing. "He doesn't have a case," David Morrison assured her. "The prenuptial agreement you signed 40 years ago specifically excluded inherited assets from marital property. Whitmore Industries was purchased with your inheritance. It's yours, completely and irrevocably." "And the house?" Helena asked. "Also purchased with inherited funds according to the records. Richard contributed nothing to the mortgage. He has no claim." "What about the money he claims to have earned during our marriage?" Morrison smiled grimly. "That money was stolen from the company. It belongs to Whitmore Industries, which is to say, it belongs to you. Every cent Richard has was taken from you, directly or indirectly. He's not entitled to a dime. Helena absorbed this information with a calm that surprised even herself. 40 years of marriage, and Richard had given her nothing but pain. Now he would get nothing but prison. The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring, but the civil proceedings moved forward immediately. Richard's assets, the ones he had hidden, the ones he had stolen, were frozen by court order. The Manhattan penthouse was seized. The offshore accounts were identified and marked for recovery. Every day brought new revelations. The forensic accountants discovered that Richard's embezzlement had actually begun much earlier than the audit had shown, possibly as far back as 20 years ago. The total amount stolen could be as high as $30 million. Helena spent her days meeting with lawyers, accountants, and investigators. She learned more about corporate finance in those weeks than she had in 40 years of marriage. Richard had always dismissed her as too ignorant to understand his work. Now she understood it better than he ever had. She also began the slow process of rebuilding Whitmore Industries. The company had been damaged by the scandal. Stock prices had dropped. Clients had fled. Employees worried about their futures. Helena addressed each problem methodically, bringing in new leadership, reassuring investors, establishing a culture of transparency that had never existed under Richard's tenure. It turned out she had a talent for business. Who knew? Her daughter Emma flew in from California to support her. They sat together in the sunroom where Helena used to wait alone, and for the first time in years, they talked honestly about everything. "I always knew something was wrong," Emma admitted. "The way Dad looked at you, the way he talked to you when he thought I wasn't listening. I wanted to say something, but you loved your father," Helena finished. "You wanted to believe the best of him." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "How could he do this to you? To us? You gave him everything." "I gave him too much," Helena said quietly. "I gave him 40 years of my life, waiting for him to love me the way I loved him. I kept telling myself that if I was patient enough, kind enough, good enough, he would eventually see me, really see me." She looked out the window at the autumn leaves, still falling from the same oak trees she had watched on the day she received the audit report. He never did. He never wanted to, and that wasn't my fault. It took me 40 years to understand that, but I finally do. Emma took her mother's hand. "What happens now?" Helena smiled. A real smile, perhaps the first one since before the party. "Now I live. Not for Richard. Not for anyone else. Just for me." The weeks passed. Richard remained in jail, unable to make the $10 million bail that the judge had set after deeming him a flight risk. His lawyers filed motion after motion, each one denied. The evidence was too strong, his behavior too damning. Helena heard through her attorney that Richard was furious. He spent his days in jail plotting revenge, making threats, insisting that his wife had set him up. He refused to accept any responsibility for his actions, blaming Helena, blaming the previous owners, blaming everyone except himself. Some people never changed. Helena had finally accepted that. She started redecorating the house, erasing 40 years of memories that now felt tainted. She donated Richard's clothes to charity, cleared his office of every trace of his presence, removed the photographs from the walls. In their place, she hung new art, pieces she had always wanted but Richard had dismissed as ugly or pointless. She painted the master bedroom a warm gold color that Richard would have hated. She filled the house with flowers and music and light. For the first time in 4 decades, it felt like her home. The night before Richard's preliminary hearing, Helena sat alone in her transformed living room, a glass of wine in her hand. She thought about the woman she had been just months ago, lonely, desperate for love, convinced that her husband's indifference was somehow her fault. That woman was gone. In her place was someone Helena was just beginning to know, someone stronger, fiercer, more capable than she had ever imagined. Tomorrow, she would face Richard in court. She would look into the eyes of the man who had called her disgusting, who had stolen from his own company, who had thrown dirty water in her face in front of 500 witnesses, and she would show him exactly what his pathetic old dinosaur was capable of. Helena finished her wine and went to bed early. She would need her strength for what was to come. The courtroom was packed. Helena had expected media attention. The story had gone viral after all, but she hadn't anticipated the circus that awaited her. News crews lined the steps of the courthouse. Photographers jostled for position. Reporters shouted questions as she walked past, her attorney at her side. She answered none of them. She simply walked forward, her head held high, wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than Richard's legal defense. Inside the courtroom, Helena took her seat in the front row. She had insisted on being there. Not as a witness, not as a victim, but as the woman who owned the company Richard had robbed. The prosecution had laid out their case meticulously. Financial records, bank statements, photographs, emails. The evidence was damning, irrefutable, overwhelming. Then it was time for Richard to be escorted in. Helena watched as the doors opened and her husband of 40 years shuffled into the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. He had lost weight in jail. His cheeks were hollow, his hair unkempt, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. Good, she thought. Now you know what it feels like to be helpless. Richard scanned the courtroom until his eyes found Helena. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not remorse. Never remorse. It was hatred. Pure, concentrated hatred for the woman who had finally seen through his mask. Helena met his gaze without flinching. The preliminary hearing proceeded. Richard's lawyers made their arguments. Entrapment, marital privilege, prosecutorial overreach. The judge listened with the patience of someone who had heard every excuse in the book. Then came the moment Helena had been waiting for. The prosecution called for the accused to make a statement before the judge ruled on the trial date. Richard's lawyers objected, but Richard himself stood up, ignoring their protests. "I want to speak," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I have the right to speak." The judge nodded. "You may address the court, Mr. Blackwood." Briefly. Richard turned to face the gallery, and specifically, to face Helena. "Everything I did for us," he began, his voice gaining strength. "For our family, for our future. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I strayed. But Helena, you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," Helena interrupted, rising to her feet. The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned forward. Richard's lawyers grabbed at his arm, but he shook them off, eyes locked on his wife. "You made mistakes?" Helena's voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like a blade. "You stole $30 million. You called me disgusting. You spent 7 years with another woman while I sat at home wondering what I had done wrong." She walked forward, toward the barrier that separated the gallery from the defense table. Guards moved to intercept her, but she stopped just short of the line, perfectly composed, perfectly in control. "You want to know what I understand, Richard?" Her eyes were cold as frozen steel, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow echoed through the silent courtroom. "I understand that I wasted 40 years of my life loving a man who never existed. The charming young accountant I married was a fiction. You were always this, a parasite wearing a human mask." Richard's face contorted. "Helena, shut your mouth." The words cracked like a whip. "You've talked for 40 years. You've lied for 40 years. Now you're going to listen." She took another step forward, close enough now that she could see the sweat beading on his forehead. "You called me dead weight. You said I was a burden around your neck." Helena's voice rose, filling every corner of the courtroom. "But here's what you never understood, you pathetic, sniveling little man. I was never the weight dragging you down. I was the only thing keeping you afloat." Her eyes burned with 4 decades of fury finally unleashed. "Without me hosting your dinners, smiling at your clients, making you look like a respectable family man, you would have been exposed years ago. Without my name, my connections, my father's reputation, you would have been nothing but a second-rate accountant cooking books in some strip mall office." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, but a whisper that cut like a surgical blade. "You think you destroyed me when you threw that dirty water? You think you broke me?" A cold, merciless smile spread across her face. "You didn't even scratch the surface. But me? I'm going to erase you from existence. Every dollar you stole, recovered. Every asset you hid, seized. Every relationship you built, destroyed." Her voice hardened into something ancient and terrible. When I'm done with you, Richard, there won't be a person alive who remembers your name without spitting afterward. Your mistress has already fled the country with whatever scraps she could grab. Your colleagues won't even visit you in prison. Your own lawyers are billing you for time they spend apologizing to the court for your existence. Helena straightened to her full height, looking down at her husband like he was something she had scraped off the bottom of her shoe. You will die in a prison cell, alone and forgotten, while I rebuild everything you tried to destroy. And in 50 years, when someone asks about Richard Blackwood, the only answer will be, oh, him? He was the pathetic little man who thought he could outsmart Helena Blackwood. She paused, letting the words sink in, watching the color drain from his face. You wanted to throw dirty water on me? Fine. I'll drown you in an ocean of consequences. You wanted to call me a pathetic old cow? Watch this pathetic old cow bury you so deep that even hell won't be able to find you. Helena turned her back on him. A final dismissal, a final rejection. Enjoy your trial, Richard. Enjoy explaining to a jury how you stole from your own company, cheated on your wife, and assaulted her in front of 500 witnesses. Enjoy watching everything you built crumble to dust while I stand on the ashes and build an empire. She walked back to her seat, her heels clicking on the marble floor like a countdown. I'll be watching from the front row every single day. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Richard stood frozen at the defense table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For the first time in 40 years, Richard Blackwood had nothing to say. The judge called for order, but Helena barely heard it. She sat in her seat, hands folded in her lap, a serene expression on her face. She had waited 40 years to say those words. They had been worth every second. The hearing concluded with the judge setting a trial date for the following month. Richard was led away in handcuffs, his head hanging low. He didn't look at Helena as he passed. He couldn't. Outside the courthouse, Helena faced the media for the first time. Microphones were thrust in her face. Questions were shouted from every direction. She raised one hand, and silence fell. I have a brief statement, she said, her voice clear and strong. For 40 years, I believed that being a good wife meant being silent, patient, and forgiving. I was wrong. Sometimes being good means speaking the truth, no matter how painful. Sometimes being good means standing up and saying, enough. She looked directly into the cameras. To every woman who has been told she isn't enough, who has been made to feel small by someone who should have loved her, I see you, and I want you to know, it's never too late to find your voice. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. Helena turned and walked to her waiting car, leaving behind a husband who would spend the rest of his life regretting the day he threw dirty water on the wrong woman. 5 years later, Helena stood at the window of her corner office on the 47th floor of the Whitmore Industries tower, watching the sunset over Manhattan. The skyline glittered with a million lights, each one a reminder of how far she had come. At 68 years old, she had accomplished more than most people did in a lifetime, and she was just getting started. The trial had ended exactly as she had predicted. Richard was found guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, money laundering, and assault. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. The judge had sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Helena had been there for every moment, every witness, every piece of evidence, every futile objection from Richard's defense team. She had watched her husband's face crumble as the verdict was read, as he finally understood that his charm and his lies would not save him. She had felt nothing but peace. The divorce was finalized shortly after the conviction. As her lawyers had predicted, Richard received nothing. The prenuptial agreement held. The stolen assets were recovered and returned to Whitmore Industries. Richard left the marriage exactly as he had entered it, with nothing but the clothes on his back. Those clothes were now a prison uniform. Helena turned away from the window and surveyed her office, a space that had once belonged to the CEO she had hired to run the company, before she realized she was better at the job herself. The walls were decorated with awards and accolades: Business Leader of the Year, Entrepreneur of the Decade, Most Influential Women in Finance. Not bad for a pathetic old dinosaur. Whitmore Industries had tripled in value under her leadership. She had modernized operations, expanded into new markets, fostered a culture of innovation and integrity that attracted top talent from around the world. The company that had been tainted by Richard's crimes had become a symbol of ethical business practices. The business magazines loved her story. The woman who bought a company as a love gift for her cheating husband, only to expose his crimes and rebuild the empire herself. It had become legend in corporate circles, a cautionary tale for fraudsters and an inspiration for women everywhere. But Helena's proudest achievement wasn't on any wall. She walked to her desk and picked up a framed photograph, Emma and her 2 grandchildren, taken at the Foundation's annual gala last spring. The Helena Blackwood Foundation for Domestic Abuse Survivors had raised over $50 million in its first 5 years, funding shelters, legal aid, and counseling services for women escaping abusive relationships. It had started with those letters, the thousands of messages from women who had seen the viral video and recognized something of themselves in Helena's story. Women who had been called names by the men who were supposed to love them. Women who had been made to feel worthless, invisible, less than human. Helena had read every single letter, and she had decided that her second act would be dedicated to helping those women find their own voices. The foundation had changed lives. Helena received updates regularly. Women who had escaped dangerous situations, who had rebuilt their careers, who had found happiness after years of despair. Each success story felt like a small victory over the man who had tried to destroy her. Last month, she had attended the graduation ceremony of a young woman who had entered one of the foundation's shelters 5 years ago, with nothing but the clothes on her back and 2 small children. Now she had a master's degree in social work and a job helping other survivors. She had hugged Helena with tears streaming down her face. "You saved my life," she had whispered. "You showed me it was possible to start over." Those moments made everything worth it. Richard, she had heard, was not doing well in prison. His charm didn't work on inmates or guards. His manipulation tactics had earned him enemies rather than allies. He spent most of his time in solitary confinement for his own protection. Helena tried not to think about him too often. He had taken enough of her mental energy for one lifetime. But occasionally, when she read another letter from a woman who had found the courage to leave an abusive relationship, she thought about how different her life might have been if she had recognized the truth about Richard sooner. She didn't dwell on regret. She simply moved forward. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Jennifer who reminded Helena of herself at that age, peeked in. "Mrs. Blackwood, your daughter is here for dinner." Helena smiled. "Send her in." Emma entered the office with the confidence of a woman who had learned from her mother's example. She had left her own unfulfilling marriage 2 years ago, a marriage that, while not abusive, had made her feel invisible in much the same way Helena had felt for decades. "I watched you stand up to Dad," Emma had told her when she announced her divorce, "and I realized I deserved to be with someone who actually sees me. Life's too short to be invisible." Now Emma was thriving. She had started her own consulting business, using the skills she had developed over years of corporate work. She was dating a kind man who looked at her like she was the most important person in the room. She was happy. "Ready for dinner?" Emma asked. "I made reservations at that new place you wanted to try." "Almost." Helena took one last look at the sunset, then gathered her things. "Let's go." They walked together through the building, past employees who nodded respectfully, past the portrait of Helena that hung in the main lobby, a gift from the board of directors on her 3rd anniversary as CEO. The artist had captured something in her eyes that Helena herself was only beginning to recognize, strength that had always been there, waiting to emerge. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clean. Helena breathed deeply, savoring the feeling of freedom that still felt new after all these years. "Mom," Emma said as they walked to the restaurant, "I've been meaning to ask, do you ever regret it, the way it all happened?" Helena considered the question carefully. She thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, lonely, desperate for love, convinced that her husband's indifference was somehow her fault. She thought about the moment she had opened that audit report and felt her entire world shatter. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret exposing him. I don't regret the trial or the foundation, or any of it. If I have one regret, it's that I waited so long. I wasted 40 years loving a man who never existed, hoping he would become someone he was never capable of being. She stopped walking and turned to face her daughter. But even that, I've made peace with. Because those 40 years taught me something important. They taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. That it's never too late to start over. That the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for something beautiful. Emma hugged her mother tight. I'm so proud of you. I'm proud of us, Helena corrected. We're Blackwood women. We don't break. We just become more ourselves. They continued to the restaurant, arm in arm, grandmother and mother, survivors and thrivers. Over dinner, they talked about Emma's children, about the foundation's upcoming fundraiser, about the book deal Helena had been offered to write her memoir. They laughed about small things and cried about big ones. They were honest with each other in a way they had never been during the years when Richard dominated their lives. When the meal was finished and the check was paid, Helena walked Emma to her car. Same time next week? Emma asked. Same time next week, Helena confirmed. I wouldn't miss it for anything. She watched her daughter drive away, then stood alone on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. 5 years ago, she had been a woman waiting for permission to live, waiting for her husband to love her, waiting for someone to tell her she was enough. Now, at 68, she had given herself all the permission she needed. Behind her, the Whitmore Industries tower gleamed in the fading light, a monument to what happens when an underestimated woman finally decides to stop waiting and start living. Helena Blackwood had spent 40 years in the shadow of a man who didn't deserve her. Now she stood in her own light, and she had never been more beautiful.